So we're going to keep this short. You know, you could study type and type anatomy for years, and some people do. It's a wonderful subject. Like I said before, designers fall in love with type. It's a beautiful thing. But for the purposes of this course, because we have so much to cover, we're going to keep the type anatomy discussion fairly short. Some important things to know, though, right before we get started. The first obvious thing to know is the difference between upper and lowercase letters. I think we all know that. Here's what it looks like. Let's move on to serif and sans serif. This is something you may not be familiar with. You know what these typefaces look like, but you may not know why these two families are different. Most of the type we use falls into one of these two camps. Serif or sans serif, it's kind of the dividing line between the broad range of typefaces that we have available to us. And they're both wonderful families of type to work from. If you don't know the difference between serif and sans serif, here it is. That little slab on the end of the letter form is a serif. That's all it is. And in sans serif typefaces, it's not there because sans means without. So there's no serif on a sans serif typeface. That's all you need to know. These two broad families of type are worth knowing about. We'll talk more about when and why to use them, and quite often why to use them together. But for now, let's just take a look at this incredibly dumb typographic humor. I shot the serif. Sorry, I promise that's the last type humor I'll use in this course. I just couldn't resist. Okay, let's talk a little bit about weights. Typefaces have weights, and we're familiar with most of these terms. Let's talk about them. Black, bold, regular, light, and ultralight. Now, not all typefaces have this broad range of weights. Some only have a couple, some have all of them. A lot of folks don't know that when we go beyond bold, quite often in many typefaces, we talk about black. So Arial black is a very heavy, very weighty typefaces. Those are weights. The baseline is the line that our letters sit on. That's all it is. The baseline is the bottom of our line of text. There's nothing more to it than that. But there's an interesting thing to know about the baseline. This is a funny thing. Letters that have a rounded bottom, remember we talked about optical illusions and perception. If I simply set a letter on a line that has a rounded bottom, it's going to feel as if it's floating unless I drop it slightly below the line. In typography, that's called the overshoot. Making sure letters with rounded bottoms sit slightly below the line, the baseline, will make sure that they feel grounded. Does this matter? Your software, your application will always take care of this for you, but if you ever find yourself putting lines of type together by hand, which you might do sometime in a title, if you're using different pieces of type and you're treating type as objects, it's good to know that letters with rounded bottoms need to have overshoot, sit below the baseline, and they won't feel as if they're floating away. The counter is the inside of a hollowed out letter. Lowercase o, lowercase e, lowercase a, those letters all have counters. The bowl is the part of the letter around the counter. Sometimes this matters if you're talking with people about how to deal with certain typographic problems, they may refer to the bowl and the counter. Again, you may not use this term ever again. It's kind of cool to know. The axis or the stress of a letter is the angle at which a letter appears to sit on the baseline. If it's straight up and down or if it's angled slightly, that's called the stress or the axis of the letter. And this really does matter. And we'll talk about why when we talk about type families. Thicks and thins. The proportional difference between thick sections of a letter and thin sections completely changes the personality of a typeface. And it's a very good thing to be aware of when we're picking type for any given instance. And we'll talk about how certain type families have a very exaggerated thick-thin relationship, others not at all. Ascenders are the stems on lowercase letters like the lowercase h or lowercase b, and descenders are the tails on lowercase letters like the lowercase g and lowercase p. Ascenders and descenders. This is a good time to talk about something that's one of my pet peeves, may not be one of yours. I think underlined or underscored type is problematic because of what it does to descenders. Now, in body copy or in paragraphs, when you're setting lots and lots of type, it's no big deal at all. But if you're putting together something with a title, with an important piece of type, and you have an underscore, you need to run it by hand so that it doesn't cut through descenders. Otherwise, I think it looks pretty bad. Okay, the X height is a relationship of lowercase letters to letters with ascenders or uppercase letters. This does matter a lot, and I'll show you why. Here we have Century Gothic and Garamond. The X height of a typeface like Century Gothic is really quite high, proportionally, compared to Garamond. Why it matters is how the type looks on the page. We have two blocks of copy here, one set in Century Gothic, the other set in Garamond. You can see a huge difference in the appearance on the page because of the relatively high X height of Century Gothic. It matters because it affects the look of the page, the readability. In this case, I think you can see that Century Gothic feels airier. It probably feels a little more modern. Garamond, exactly the same point size, 22 point, feels more constricted. Neither one is good or bad. There are times when you might want to use Garamond. But it's nice to know that X height has a huge effect on how type appears on the stage. So like I said, there's a lot more to know about type anatomy, but for now, I think we're going to call that good, and we're going to move on to talking about type styles and families.